There she was, Martha Stewart, the woman who had built an empire out of linen, cookbooks, and the fantasy of the perfect American home. For decades, she was untouchable. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was the curator of taste, the face that told America what elegance should look like, what a good life meant. And then, in a matter of months, the polished veneer cracked. Cameras no longer followed her into immaculate kitchens or blooming gardens. They followed her into courtrooms. Headlines that once praised her empire now screamed words like fraud, deception, insider trading. And in Haingin-le-Bon, the unthinkable happened. Martha Stewart, America's domestic goddess, was sentenced to prison. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a cultural earthquake. How could the woman who taught millions how to roast a turkey to perfection, fold napkins into swans, and design homes with grace be the same woman convicted of corporate deceit? Her brand had been built on trust and aspiration, and suddenly it was tarnished with betrayal. She became a symbol not of perfection, but of hubris. The story could have ended there, a cautionary tale, neatly filed away alongside other fallen icons. But Martha Stewart didn't disappear into shame. She didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, she did something almost unimaginable. She rebuilt, slowly, defiantly, and in her own unconventional way. From prison uniforms to primetime television, from disgrace to unexpected partnerships with unlikely figures like Snoop Dogg, Martha transformed what seemed like the end into one of the most bizarre and fascinating reinventions in American celebrity culture. Tonight, we unravel the story of Martha Stewart, not just the homemaker who became a billionaire, and not just the inmate who became a punchline. This is the story of how a single scandal could destroy a brand or give birth to an entirely new one. Was it a tragic fall from grace or a masterclass in survival? That's the question we'll explore as we dive into the life of a woman who went from America's kitchen to America's courtroom and back again. Long before she was Martha Stewart, Inc., she was simply Martha Stewart, born in August 1941 in Jersey City, New Jersey. The daughter of Polish immigrants, her childhood was modest but deeply rooted in discipline and craft. Her mother, known for her precise cooking and needlework, instilled in Martha the idea that details matter, that beauty and order were not luxuries, but values. Her father, a passionate gardener, taught her patience, precision, and the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands. The Stewart household wasn't wealthy, but it was resourceful. In a world where every penny had to be stretched, Martha learned how to sew clothes, cook meals from scratch, and cultivate a garden that could feed a family. These weren't hobbies, they were survival skills. Yet, in the hands of a young Martha, they began to look like art forms. Even as a child, she was competitive, precise, and determined to outshine expectations. By her teenage years, Martha's striking looks caught attention. At just 15, she began working as a model, appearing in print advertisements and fashion shows to help fund her college education. It was a glimpse into glamour, a stark contrast to the modest home she came from, but it also revealed something else. Martha knew how to sell an image. She understood the power of presentation, of crafting a version of yourself that the world couldn't ignore. After high school, she attended Barnard College in New York City, first studying chemistry before shifting toward art, European history, and architecture. It was a period of curiosity and transition, but above all, it grounded her in culture and design. She married Andrew Stewart in 1941, still only 20 years old, and together they built what appeared to be a conventional family life. But Martha was never content to be just a housewife. Beneath the surface, she was studying, experimenting, and strategizing. Every dinner she hosted, every room she decorated, was a rehearsal for something larger. The seeds of her empire were already being planted. She wasn't simply learning how to cook, garden, and entertain. She was learning how to teach those things, how to transform private skills into public influence. While the America of the 1941 was in the midst of social revolution, Martha quietly forged her own path, a blueprint for the empire she would later command. Her early life is often portrayed as simple and traditional, but the truth is, Martha Stewart was never ordinary. She was absorbing, calculating, shaping herself into something far bigger than her circumstances. The little girl from Jersey City was already imagining a life where perfection wasn't just a standard, it was a brand. The 1990s were a decade of transition, not just for America, but for Martha Stewart herself. After leaving her modeling career behind, she reinvented herself once again, this time stepping into the world of food and hospitality. She and her husband Andrew purchased a farmhouse in Westport, Connecticut, and Martha began restoring it with relentless precision. That farmhouse would become both a sanctuary and a stage, a living showcase of her talents in cooking, gardening, and entertaining. Martha launched a catering business in 1990, and almost instantly, her reputation began to spread. Clients marveled at the attention to detail, the artistry of presentation, and the aura of sophistication she brought to something as simple as a luncheon. Martha wasn't just preparing meals, she was creating experiences. Every event was staged like a scene from a glossy magazine, and soon enough, the magazines came calling. Her big break came in 1990 with the publication of her first book, Entertaining. It was more than a cookbook, it was a manifesto of lifestyle. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies, cementing Martha as the new authority on elegance in the American home. For women across the country, she wasn't just an author, she was a guide, showing them how to elevate the ordinary into the extraordinary. For the media, she was a revelation, a business-savvy homemaker who understood both tradition and aspiration. By the late 1990s and early 1990s, Martha Stewart had become a cultural force. She launched a magazine, Martha Stewart Living, and later a television show by the same name. Both were extensions of her brand, polished, meticulous, aspirational. She wasn't just selling recipes or decor ideas, she was selling a vision of life itself, one that millions of Americans longed for. Investors noticed in 1990, her company, Martha Stewart Living Omnimedia, went public on the New York Stock Exchange. On the very first day of trading, the stock doubled, and Martha became the first self-made female billionaire in the United States. It was an extraordinary triumph. The little girl from Jersey City, once sewing her own clothes and helping her immigrant parents, was now one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the world. But with success came scrutiny. Critics accused her of promoting an unrealistic ideal, of creating pressure for women to live up to impossible standards of perfection. Yet, for Martha, perfection was never optional. It was the foundation of her empire. She embraced the spotlight, expanded her reach, and continued to grow her influence. The rise seemed unstoppable. Martha Stewart wasn't just a brand, she was a phenomenon. And yet, just as the empire reached its zenith, cracks began to form, cracks that would soon shatter the perfect facade. By the late 1990s, Martha Stewart was no longer just a personality. She was an institution. Her face beamed from television screens, her voice guided readers through glossy magazines, and her books lined the shelves of households across America. To millions, she was the voice of domestic authority, the woman who transformed homemaking from an invisible labor into an art form worthy of admiration. If Norman Rockwell had painted America's ideal home, Martha Stewart had shown the country how to live inside it. The empire had many pillars. Her magazine, Martha Stewart Living, reached over 2 million subscribers at its height, its pages filled with immaculate recipes, holiday decor ideas, and gardening secrets. Her syndicated television program taught audiences not only how to bake bread or trim roses, but how to aspire. Each episode was carefully choreographed, showcasing Martha as a woman who lived inside a world of timeless grace and order. Her home became a set, her garden a stage, and her very life a product. Her expansion was ruthless, but always polished. There were Martha Stewart furniture lines, paint collections, home goods, even partnerships with retail giants like Kmart. For ordinary families, buying a Martha Stewart product was like buying a piece of perfection, a way to invite a little of her world into theirs. And when her company went public in 1990, the financial markets validated what her audience already knew. Martha Stewart had turned the business of good living into a billion-dollar enterprise. Overnight, she became America's first self-made female billionaire. But with that staggering success came an equally staggering level of scrutiny. Journalists dug into her past, competitors sharpened their critiques, and cultural commentators began to question the morality of her empire. Was she empowering women or pressuring them into impossible standards? Was she democratizing elegance or selling an unattainable fantasy wrapped in glossy pages and polished TV sets? Still, Martha appeared untouchable. At her peak, she exuded the cool control of someone who had mastered not just her brand, but her image. Her interviews were precise, her public appearances immaculate. She was a woman who never appeared unprepared, never revealed a crack in the porcelain surface of perfection. To the outside world, Martha Stewart was the ultimate embodiment of discipline and success. Behind the scenes, however, the weight of her empire was immense. Employees whispered of her demanding nature, her insistence on precision down to the smallest detail. Friends noted her tendency to dominate conversations, to turn every gathering into a demonstration of her authority. Even her personal life carried the strain of her image. Her marriage to Andrew Stewart had collapsed years earlier, leaving her with both independence and loneliness. Martha had sacrificed much for her empire: companionship, privacy, and perhaps even vulnerability. Yet none of this mattered to her audience. To them, Martha was a symbol, and symbols are meant to be flawless. Each Thanksgiving special, each glossy magazine cover, reaffirmed her place as the arbiter of taste in American culture. She wasn't just keeping up with trends, she was defining them. For every critic who mocked her obsessive standards, there were millions who aspired to them. The irony is that it was during this period of apparent invincibility that the seeds of her downfall were planted. In the frenzy of stock market speculation at the turn of the millennium, Martha made a decision that seemed small, even trivial. She sold shares of Clone Systems, a biotech company, just days before its stock price collapsed. For many, it was a routine financial maneuver. For Martha, it became the decision that shattered everything. The irony was brutal. Here was a woman who had spent decades crafting a reputation for order, trust, and transparency, suddenly accused of deception. The perfect hostess, the domestic goddess, now found herself under investigation by federal authorities. The headlines turned savage. The same media that once worshipped her as America's homemaking queen now cast her as a symbol of corporate greed and arrogance. As the millennium dawned, Martha Stewart stood on the mountaintop of her career. She had wealth, influence, and cultural dominance that few women before her had ever achieved. Yet the higher she climbed, the steeper the fall would be. And in Hangin-Lair Moat, that fall began slow at first, then sudden, then unstoppable. What makes Martha's peak so fascinating isn't just the magnitude of her success, but the fragility hidden beneath it. For years, she had sold perfection as a lifestyle, but perfection is a dangerous illusion. It leaves no room for mistakes, no space for missteps. When the cracks appeared, they weren't just fractures in a brand, they were earthquakes in the American imagination. For Martha Stewart, the empire of perfection was real, and so was the collapse that would follow. In December Hangin-Lair Moat, just days after America was still reeling from the trauma of Chin Mui Moat, Martha Stewart's empire faced a crisis of a very different kind. The biotechnology firm Clone Systems had just received devastating news. The Food and Drug Administration rejected its application for a promising cancer drug. The company's stock price plummeted almost overnight, but Martha Stewart, by sheer coincidence, or so she claimed, had sold nearly shares of Clone the day before the collapse, avoiding a loss of about Mui Lam. At first, it seemed minor, even insignificant. After all, Martha was worth hundreds of millions. What did $45,000 matter? But when federal investigators began piecing together the trades, whispers turned into accusations. Prosecutors alleged that Martha had acted on insider information, tipped off by her broker, about the impending fall. What might have been dismissed as a trivial decision now became the catalyst for one of the most high-profile trials of the decade. The timing could not have been worse. America, in the early Hangins, was still gripped by anger toward corporate scandals. The Enron collapse had destroyed pensions and livelihoods, WorldCom's fraud was making headlines, and ordinary Americans were demanding accountability from the wealthy elite. Into this atmosphere stepped Martha Stewart, not a faceless executive, but the queen of domestic perfection. To the media, her case was irresistible. It wasn't just about finance, it was about image, hypocrisy, and the fall of a woman who had sold America the dream of flawless living. By Hangin-Lair Moat, Stewart was indicted on multiple charges, including securities fraud, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to federal investigators. The courtroom became her new stage, and for the first time, Martha was stripped of control. No magazine layout, no television edit, could polish what unfolded before the jury. The prosecution painted her as arrogant, unwilling to admit a mistake, someone who thought the rules did not apply to her. The defense countered that she was a scapegoat, a target chosen not for the scale of her alleged crime, but for the size of her celebrity. Outside the courthouse, the spectacle was relentless. Tabloids splashed her image alongside words like liar, cheat, and fraud. Protesters held signs condemning her greed, while loyal fans defended her as the victim of a witch hunt. Every detail, what she wore to court, how she carried herself, even her choice of facial expression, was dissected by pundits and late-night comedians. The woman who once defined aspiration had become late-night fodder. The verdict came on March num. Haingin Lairborn. Martha Stewart was found guilty on 4 counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements. The punishment? 5 months in federal prison, 5 months of home confinement, and 2 years of supervised release. For Martha, it was a humiliation beyond comprehension. She had gone from America's first female billionaire to federal inmate number Numwilamngin Muchambe Mwinamwibon. In October of that year, Martha reported to Alderson Federal Prison Camp in West Virginia, a facility nicknamed Camp Cupcake for its relatively soft conditions. But the reality for her was far from sweet. Gone were the immaculate kitchens, the carefully staged gardens, the crisp linens. Instead, she faced communal showers, cafeteria meals, and the harsh stripping away of personal identity. For the first time in her adult life, Martha Stewart had no control over her environment. Yet, even in prison, Martha displayed the qualities that had built her empire: discipline, precision, and an uncanny ability to adapt. Reports described her as keeping to herself, teaching other inmates how to crochet and cook, even tending to prison gardens. She refused to let the experience break her. Instead, she reframed it as a challenge, another stage of reinvention. But outside the prison walls, her empire was crumbling. Stock prices of Martha Stewart Living Omni-Media nosedived. Advertisers pulled back. Television executives questioned her future. For many, the Martha Stewart brand was dead, its promise of perfection poisoned by the image of its founder in a prison uniform. And yet, even as America laughed at her downfall, there was something about Martha's resilience that unsettled her critics. She served her sentence, endured the humiliation, and then emerged not broken, but sharper, tougher, and, in a strange way, more human. The scandal had destroyed the image of flawless perfection, but it had also stripped away the distance between Martha and the public. Suddenly, she wasn't just a goddess on a pedestal. She was flawed, punished, and perhaps even relatable. Her prison time had been meant as an ending, but for Martha Stewart, it became the beginning of something no one could have predicted: a bizarre, ironic, and ultimately successful second act. When Martha Stewart walked out of Alderson Federal Prison Camp in March Haingin Lairnum, many assumed she would fade into obscurity. Her brand had been battered, her reputation dragged through tabloids, her empire reduced to a shadow of its former self. But Martha Stewart was not built to disappear. She stepped out into the cold air with a quiet determination. If the world had redefined her as a fallen icon, she would rewrite the definition herself. Her comeback was audacious. Within months, Martha launched a new television program, The Martha Stewart Show, reclaiming the very medium that had once celebrated and then ridiculed her. She leaned into her scandal, acknowledging her past without shame, reframing herself as both survivor and teacher. Advertisers returned. Viewers tuned in, curious to see whether perfection could rise again from disgrace. And, remarkably, it did. But her most surprising reinvention came not from polished studios or glossy magazines. It came from an unlikely friendship. In Haingin Lairtam, Martha Stewart and rapper Snoop Dogg appeared together on The Martha Stewart Show. The pairing was so bizarre, so unexpected, that it instantly became cultural gold. The domestic queen and the West Coast rapper laughed, cooked, and bantered as though they had been friends for decades. What began as a novelty turned into a phenomenon. By Haingin Lairmuisao, the two launched Martha, Snoop's Potluck Dinner Party, a VH series that blended comedy, cooking, and celebrity cameos. The show was a hit, not just because of its humor, but because it symbolized Martha's complete transformation. She was no longer just the emblem of perfection. She was now a pop culture icon, self-aware, unafraid of irony, and willing to reinvent her image through contrast and surprise. This reinvention carried power. By embracing her scandal, Martha disarmed it. By collaborating with someone as culturally opposite as Snoop Dogg, she proved that her brand could adapt, expand, and even thrive in the unpredictable world of modern celebrity. The woman once mocked for her arrogance became beloved for her humor. The domestic goddess became a symbol of resilience. Today, Martha Stewart's legacy is paradoxical. She is remembered both as the billionaire perfectionist who fell from grace and as the unlikely comeback queen who turned a prison sentence into a cultural reset. Her story raises questions about forgiveness, reinvention, and the elasticity of the American dream. Was her fall truly a punishment, or was it the spark that allowed her to evolve beyond the confines of perfection? One thing is certain, Martha Stewart's halo may have been tarnished, but it was never forgotten.